Every language has its own kind of music, right? Its own unique rhythm. But that music doesn't just appear. It's forged, usually in the fire of some pretty intense debate and discovery. Today, we're jumping into the story of how the English language, way back in the Renaissance, had to literally fight to find its own poetic voice.
So that brings us to the big question. How does a language figure out how it's supposed to sound when it's trying to be art? Do you stick with your own traditions? Or do you look to the great works of the past and try to copy them? For English poets, this wasn't just some philosophical question. It was a full-blown identity crisis.
You've got to understand, these Renaissance poets were stuck right between two worlds. In one corner, you had the old way, the homegrown, stress-based rhythms of medieval English poetry. Think of stuff like Chaucer. But in the other corner, you had this dazzling new influence, the rediscovered poetry of classical Greece and Rome. And that stuff was totally different. It was based on the length of syllables, and this is the important part. It looked down on rhyme as a crude, kind of barbaric invention.
And you guessed it, this clash of ideas kicks off a huge intellectual battle. We're talking about a fight for the very soul of English poetry, a conflict that was going to decide how the language would sing for centuries.
This wasn't just some polite disagreement over tea. It was basically the rhyme wars, and the central question was explosive. Did rhyme, this supposedly clumsy, newfangled thing, actually have any place in serious, high-minded English poetry?
And this war had its generals. On one side, you had Samuel Daniel. He publishes his passionate A Defense of Rhyme, arguing that it was a natural, beautiful part of the English tradition. On the other side, Thomas Campion. He wanted to throw rhyme out completely and go back to a pure, unrhymed style, just like the classical masters. It was a head-to-head literary showdown.
And Campion wasn't just some lone voice in the wilderness. This quote really tells you how intense the feeling was. The most influential thinkers of the day, the humanists, they saw rhyme as a barbarism. Seriously, they thought it was this crude leftover from the Dark Ages, and it was holding English back from being truly great.
So why does all this academic bickering matter? Well, it had massive consequences. It forced poets to get creative and find a new foundation for their work. This whole fight directly led to the rise of something called blank verse. That's unrhymed iambic pentameter. And that just so happens to be the form that writers like Christopher Marlowe and, oh yeah, a guy named William Shakespeare would go on to master. This argument literally forced them to innovate.
Okay, so into this absolute chaos steps our first hero. A guy who decided that what English poets really needed wasn't another argument, but a set of practical, down-to-earth instructions. In 1575, George Gascoigne writes certain notes of instruction. Now, this is a huge deal. It's considered the very first essay of literary criticism in the English language. But it wasn't some stuffy philosophical text. It was a hands-on how-to guide for poets who were just trying to figure out what to do. He was bringing order to the chaos. And his advice was just brilliantly practical. He laid out these clear rules. First, he says, start with a good idea, a fine invention, before you even worry about pretty words. Second, don't just rhyme for the sake of rhyming. It has to have a reason. Third, and this is so important, make your lines sound natural. Respect the way people actually talk. And finally, he told them to use simple one-syllable words, arguing that it made the poetry more authentically English. So, Gascoigne gave poets a rule book, the how-to. But our next key figure, George Putnam, wanted to give them something more. He wanted to give them a philosophy, the why. He wasn't just interested in the craft. He wanted to elevate English poetry into a true art form. His big work from 1589, The Art of English Poesy, had a really grand ambition. It was all about proving that writing poems in English wasn't some silly hobby. No, it was a serious, dignified art that required just as much skill and study as writing in Latin or Greek. And honestly, you can't overstate how huge Putnam's contribution was. He didn't just add more rules, he built the entire intellectual house that English poetry would live in. He justified why poetry mattered to society, he created the very first system for actually classifying English meter, and he helped standardize the critical language we still use today, words like ode and lyric. But you know, his most important idea might have been about the poet's own mind. He argued that what makes a poet special isn't just their skill with words. It's something he called fantaisie, a clear and bright imagination. This was a massive shift away from just seeing poetry as, a fancy way of making a persuasive argument. And here's the revolutionary idea that came from that. Putnam claims that the very best poetry happens when the poet is being their most natural self, when their unique imagination is shining through, not when they're just being artificial and blindly following a bunch of old rules. Suddenly, the artist's inner world was starting to matter more than the rule book.
This led to another really subtle but profound shift. For centuries, poetry was seen as a tool for teaching morals. But Putnam started pushing this idea that art could have another purpose, simply to give pleasure. It was a quiet first step towards the idea that art could exist for its own sake.
So, after all the arguments, all the rulemaking, all the deep philosophical thinking, what was the end result? Well, a new, confident, and uniquely English kind of poetry was finally forged.
We can basically map out the whole journey right here. It starts with the native rhythms of the medieval period. Then boom, the Renaissance identity crisis hits, that clash with the classical world. In steps Gascoigne with a practical rulebook to calm everyone down. Then Putnam comes along and elevates the whole thing to an art of the imagination. And by the time you hit the 1600s, the foundation is set. English verse is standardized, it's confident, and it's ready for its golden age, with Shakespeare, Donne, and Milton. Which kind of leaves us with one last thought. Putnam helped shift poetry's goal toward pleasure, towards expressing a natural imagination. And it makes you wonder, right? Nearly 450 years later, in our own art, our movies, our music, our TV shows, what rules are we all following? And more importantly, which ones are we trying to